Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take stacks of complex sources, distill the essential knowledge, and deliver it to you without all the academic baggage.
That's the goal.
Today, we are plunging deep, really deep, into the introduction of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's defining work, Phenomenology of Perception.
And this isn't just, a historical document for philosophy majors. It is a full-scale assault on how modern science and classical philosophy for centuries believed we interacted with reality.
An assault is a good word for it.
It really is. It fundamentally changed how we talk about our bodies, our senses, and even something as basic as what it means to see a red square.
Our sources for this are, well, they're dense, they are demanding, but they're utterly foundational to 20th century thought. So our mission for you, the listener, isn't just to summarize his conclusions.
No, not at all.
We want to rigorously reconstruct the engine of his argument. We're going to perform a kind of logical audit moving through 4 key stages.
Right. First, we define his core thesis. Then we'll break down his 3 main logical attacks on his predecessors.
After that, we need to clarify his vocabulary, because he uses words in very specific ways.
And finally, we'll do a pedagogical breakdown. We're going to take the single most difficult concept in the text and really unpack it.
But before all that, we need to understand the stakes here. You said it was an assault. What was he fighting against?
He's fighting a fundamental philosophical error. He calls it the prejudice in favor of an objective world.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It's the assumption that reality is basically a collection of neat, measurable facts. Things that exist perfectly outside of us, independent of our perspective, just waiting for science to measure them.
And he's saying that's the wrong starting point.
He's saying that by accepting that premise, traditional thought, both science and philosophy, completely misses the meaningful, immediate, and, the lived structure of our actual experience.
So if the world isn't just a passive collection of stimuli waiting for us to measure it, then what exactly is perception?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And that's our question for today.
Okay, let's unpack this and start with the absolute core. Before we get into all the detailed arguments, if you had to boil down Merleau-Ponty's entire claim from this introduction into one single coherent sentence, what would it be? What is the executive thesis?
Okay, the central claim is that traditional definitions of perception, which are rooted in either pure sensation, that's empiricism, or abstract judgment, that's intellectualism, they fail.
They fail because why?
They fail because perception is fundamentally an original, meaningful organization of the world. He calls it a phenomenal field. It's a dynamic structure that you just can't reduce to the neat, objective, determinate elements that science likes to talk about.
That's a mouthful. But the key phrase that jumps out at me there is phenomenal field. So if I'm following you, he's saying we have to stop analyzing perception based on objective data, like, I don't know, measuring the exact wavelength of light hitting the retina.
Exactly. Stop that.
And instead, we have to describe perception as we actually live it, as a field of interacting meanings.
Precisely. And that takes us right to the philosophical problem he's trying to solve. This whole text is an attempt to dismantle the dogmatic structure that philosophy and psychology had built around the idea of consciousness.
And what was that structure?
The assumption was that there were only 2 ways to understand perception. Either 1, you were a passive receiver of simple raw inputs.
Just a camera, basically.
A camera, yes. Or 2, you were an active intellectual processor of those raw inputs. A computer.
So he's saying the menu was limited to 2 bad choices, a camera or a computer.
Exactly. And the source of those bad choices is that deep-seated prejudice in favor of an objective world.
It all comes back to that.
It does. If you assume the world is just a collection of perfectly explicit, determinate facts out there, then, well, human consciousness has to be one of those 2 things. It must be either a passive receiver of those facts or an abstract processor that manipulates them.
Let's detail those twin errors, because they're the main targets of his whole project. What's the first one? Empiricism. And why does he find it so lacking?
The first error is empiricism. It tries to build our entire conscious experience out of what it calls pure sensations.
Pure sensations? Like what?
Well, the empiricist view says that a sensation is a simple, isolatable impact, an instantaneous, dot-like stimulus that doesn't really have a place and doesn't signify anything on its own.
It's like saying a house is just a pile of bricks, and if we just analyze one single brick, we can understand the whole house.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And historically, the aim of this approach was, to ground philosophy in the measurable reality of natural science, right? They were trying to be rigorous.
Sure, it sounds scientific.
It sounds rigorous, yes, but it's ultimately incredibly reductive. They assume that if you analyze any complex perception, you'll eventually hit this pure, unanalyzed, determinate little unit of sensation.
But Merleau-Ponty's point is that you can never actually find that pure sensation.
You can't. He's going to argue that it's completely mythical. It's, in his words, imperceptible and so inconceivable.
Okay, so if that's the first error, what's the second? Intellectualism. This one basically sees the failure of empiricism and just swings wildly in the other direction, right? It puts everything in the mind.
Correct. Intellectualism tries to reduce perception entirely to abstract thought, to eternal logical categories. It sees perception as a purely logical judgment or an interpretation.
So when the world gives us blurry data, the intellectualist says the mind just steps in and cleans it up.
That's it. So if you see a blurry figure in the distance, the intellectualist argues your mind steps in, it applies a logical category or a memory, and it judges that figure to be a man. It actively constructs the meaning.
And this approach, even though it's the opposite of empiricism, it still fails because it's holding on to that same prejudice for the objective world.
Absolutely.
It assumes the mind is dealing with pure truth, and it's just correcting the body's messy, deficient inputs.
Absolutely. And the critical point is that both philosophies fail for the exact same fundamental reason. They overlook the living, the contextual, the already meaningful quality of actual perceptual consciousness.
It's never just raw data.
Never. And it's never just an abstract calculation either. The world, as Merleau-Ponty sees it, is always presented to us as an already organized, situated field.
This reminds me of that classic psychological mistake he talks about, the experience error. Can you define that quickly? Because it feels like the trap that both of these schools fall into.
Yes, the experience error is the mistake of confusing objective properties with subjective experience.
So confusing the map with the territory.
In a way, it means we transpose what we know to be the scientifically objective properties of things, like a color's precise wavelength or lines' mathematical parallelism, into our consciousness of them.
And what's the result of that?
We end up defining, as he says, perception out of things perceived. And in doing that, we fail to understand either the scientific object or the living experience.
That sets the stage beautifully for the logical demolition. If perception isn't just passive reception, and it isn't pure calculation, Merleau-Ponty has to prove why those two ideas are impossible starting points for experience. All right, now for the really rigorous part. Merleau-Ponty doesn't just, state his case. He surgically dismantles the foundational claims of the last few centuries of thought.
It really does.
So we need to go beyond just reciting his arguments and really wrestle with his logical reconstruction, starting with his primary target, the critique of empiricism and the idea of pure sensation.
The key move here is proving that the basic unit of our experience is never that single, simple, dot-like impression. It's always a relationship. For the empiricist, that single, raw sensation is the philosophical building block. Merleau-Ponty says you just can't find this unit in lived experience.
Let's try to translate his first logical chain against empiricism into plain language, and maybe we can debate each premise as we go.
Yeah, we have to begin with the definition of the term he's rejecting. So here's the first premise, P1.
Go for it.
Logical chain 1, P1. Pure sensation is defined theoretically as an undifferentiated, instantaneous, dot-like impact, coinciding absolutely with the sense material, having no objective place, and signifying nothing.
Okay, so P1 defines the philosophical straw man. A pure unit of raw input, stripped of all context, all meaning, all location. But where does this argument immediately start to break down in reality?
It breaks down in premise 2, which deals with even the most basic factual experiences, P2. The most rudimentary factual perceptions, even in creatures like apes or hens, have a bearing on relationships, not on absolute isolated terms.
He brings up Gestalt psychology experiments here.
Yes, showing that subjects, human or animal, they don't react to absolute values, like a specific shade of gray. They react to the difference between two values.
Right, I remember this one. If an experiment trains a hen to peck at the darker of two gray squares, and then you replace the lighter gray with a new, even darker gray,
What happens?
the hen pecks at the new, darker square. It doesn't peck at the old shade of gray it was conditioned to, even though the stimuli are objectively different now.
Exactly. And that one small fact just destroys the concept of absolute sensation. The hen isn't reacting to the absolute quality of that first shade of gray. It's reacting to the relation of darker than.
which confirms that the most basic unit of perception is relational and meaningful right from the very start.
It has to be.
And that leads directly to his crucial structural concept, the figure on a background. Why is this relational structure the absolute minimum requirement for any perception to happen at all?
Well, that brings us to P3. P3. The fundamental unit of perception is always a figure on a background, without which a phenomenon cannot be said to be perception at all.
And what does that mean?
It means the figure's edges belong to it, and each part spontaneously arouses the expectation of more than it contains.
Yeah.
Experience is always structured. It is never a mosaic of dots.
Okay, let me challenge this for a second, just to play the empiricist here.
Yeah.
Can't I just imagine a truly homogeneous field, like a perfectly plain white wall? If I try to break that down point by point, aren't those individual points of white pure sensation?
Merleau-Ponty would say no, because even when you're looking at a white patch on a homogeneous background, that patch only comes into being as a figure precisely because it is set against a background.
Ah, so the background is necessary.
It's essential. If the field were truly homogeneous, offering nothing to be noticed, it wouldn't be given to perception at all. As soon as you try to isolate a point, you immediately make that point the figure, and everything else becomes the ground. You can't escape the organization.
So the organization, the meaningful structure, is the irreducible definition of the perceptual phenomenon. The moment I try to isolate a supposed pure sensation, I've already given it a position, an edge, and a context.
Which are all relational properties, not pure dot-like inputs.
And that brings us to the inevitable conclusion.
C. Therefore, the notion of pure sensation is not only undiscoverable, but also imperceptible, and so inconceivable as an instant of perception. The very attempt to define a pure, simple element commits the experience error and leads you to a concept that just can't exist in reality.
This also seems to have a huge impact on the constancy hypothesis, right? That's the psychological dogma that really underpins empiricism.
Oh, absolutely. The belief that a specific stimulus always generates a constant elementary perception.
But his argument shows that's just not true.
It's the logical consequence of trying to isolate sensation. If sensation were pure, a stimulus of X magnitude should always result in an experience of Y. But Merleau-Ponty shows this dogma is constantly betrayed by our experience.
Like in the Miller-Lyer illusion.
Perfect example. Two lines are objectively equal, but they appear unequal because of the arrowheads. The empiricist has to say this is an error, a mistake. But Merleau-Ponty says the lines in that figure have literally ceased to be equal for perception.
He argues that the moment you introduce the arrowheads, the whole structure just organizes itself into something new. The objective reality, the mathematical equality of the lines, is still there for a physicist, but it has no presence in the lived reality of the person seeing the illusion.
Correct. And for the empiricist to insist that the lines must be equal, because science says so, they have to invent what Merleau-Ponty calls an auxiliary hypothesis, evolved to save the prejudice in favor of an objective world.
They're using science to correct experience rather than studying experience as it actually is.
Exactly. And he doesn't just stop at psychology. He throws out the physiological attempts to find pure sensation in the body, too.
How so?
Well, if the nervous system were just a transmitter, a simple machine, then damage to one part of it should just eliminate one specific sensation. But that's not what happens.
What does happen?
He cites clinical observations. If a patient experiences a loss of sight, it affects all colors. The result is a shift toward a less differentiated and more primitive structure, not the systematic removal of certain color receptors.
So the body isn't just a collection of independent wires.
Not at all. It's an integrated system that's constantly seeking the maximum functional grip on the world. Even simple movements, like compensating for a low-touch threshold by a more vigorous movement of the hand, show that the body isn't passively receiving data, it's actively integrating and structuring it.
Okay, so if the first point successfully dismantles the whole idea of pure sensation, the empiricist still has a fallback position. Associationism.
Right.
They might admit that, okay, complex meaning isn't in the raw dot-like impressions, but they'll argue that meaning arises through the mechanical linking of those impressions based on past experience, contiguity, or resemblance. Merleau-Ponty calls this philosophically circular.
He does. He argues that associationism is just a bad metaphor hiding a deeper, ready-made recognition.
What does he mean by that?
Well, associationism is fundamentally about substitution. Impression A announces impression B, which has been linked to it by habit. But this announcement is never actually justified by the nature of the impression itself. It's an external mechanical linking mechanism.
Let's link this to a real-world psychological idea, Pavlovian conditioning. The dog associates the sound of the bell, an impression, with the sight of food, another impression, and eventually salivates. That is the very definition of associationism, isn't it? An external connection creates a conditioned response.
It is. But Merleau-Ponty would ask, for those two elements to be associated in the first place, they must already have been grouped as a unique object. The dog is conditioned to the sound as a signal, which is already a meaningful entity, not just an undifferentiated air vibration.
So the grouping of the bell sound as the dinner bell, has to precede the association.
It has to. Let's trace the second logical chain to show exactly why associationism is circular.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Logical chain 2, P1. Associationism claims meaning arises from impressions being left by external connections, contiguity or resemblance, where one impression announces others without ever justifying the announcement. So meaning is just seen as an external habit or a memory substitution.
And the classic example is walking toward a shoreline and seeing various lines, masts, a hull, maybe a flag, that slowly come together. The associationist says my mind is matching those individual lines to past memories of ship.
But Merleau-Ponty asks the crucial question. How did those disparate lines even get grouped together in the first place to trigger the memory of ship? That's premise 2.
Which is
EP2. For elements to be grouped together into a unique thing, a gestalt or a synopsis, they must first be placed on the same footing as a unique object in the phenomenal field. The raw data has to coalesce into a meaningful unity first.
And this is where the circularity hits. The associationist argues that proximity and resemblance cause the grouping. But Merleau-Ponty flips this completely. He says you can only notice those characteristics after the grouping has already spontaneously happened.
Precisely. That's premise 3. The reversal of cause and effect. P3. The grouping of data into a thing is not caused by de facto proximities or likenesses, but the spontaneous perception of the grouping precedes and is a condition of analytically noticing resemblance or proximity. The unity of the object is based on the foreshadowing of an imminent order.
So when I'm walking toward the shore and the ship emerges, I don't analyze pieces of wood and then calculate ship.
No.
I feel a tension, a vague expectation, and then suddenly the sight is recast in a manner satisfying to my vague expectation. The feeling of an imminent order or that tension is the primary phenomenon.
And so the conclusion must follow. C. Therefore, association never comes into play as an autonomous force. Rather, the imminent significance of the percept is presupposed in all association, and the projection of memories is merely a bad metaphor hiding a deeper, ready-made recognition.
This deeply challenges all forms of behaviorism and psychological reductionism, which all rely on those external mechanical connections. If perception is already meaningful, then we're not just passive recipients waiting for external stimuli to chain together our mental furniture.
Exactly. And this circularity applies just as much to errors like the proofreader's illusion, where you read the word deduction when the word that's actually printed is destruction.
Right. The empiricist would say your memory just projected the missing elements.
But Merleau-Ponty asks, how does the mind know to project the memory of deduction and not, say, deflection or detonation?
The present perception must already have assumed a specific structure and meaning before it can recall precisely this memory and not all the others. The visual data must already be oriented toward deduction.
Which means the wrong word, the illusionary cat in the puzzle picture, or the feeling of relief in a painting are all coming into being before my eyes and at this moment. It's an act of spontaneous, present meaning-making. Perception is the recognition of a meaningful whole that is, in his words, pregnant with an irreducible meaning.
Okay, so Merleau-Ponty has successfully shown that perception cannot be reduced to the body's raw sensations or the mechanical linking of past experiences. Now, we shift the critique from the realm of the body to the realm of the mind.
Right.
If perception isn't passive reception, does that mean it's purely abstract rational judgment?
This is the position of intellectualism, which was championed historically by thinkers like Descartes. They argue that when sensation fails to provide perfect clarity, the mind just steps in with logical concepts and eternal truths to correct the apparent reality.
They see perception as a triumph of reason over the chaos of appearance.
Pretty much.
Let's use the most famous example. Descartes looking down from his window, seeing men in hats and coats, and concluding, "I therefore do not see them, I judge them to be there." Why does Merleau-Ponty say this rationalist definition fails so badly?
It fails because, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, the intellectualist defines judgment as happening everywhere that sensation isn't. And this dissolves the common sense distinction we absolutely need between seeing and judging.
What do you mean?
Well, if perception is pure judgment, how can we differentiate between a true perception and a delusion?
Right. We need to be able to say that the madman thinks he sees what he does not see. That implies there's a difference between the immediate act of seeing and the subsequent act of analysis or correction. If seeing is judging, the whole distinction just collapses.
Exactly. And this leads us to the third logical chain, which attacks this idea of perception as pure interpretation.
Let's walk through it.
Logical chain 3, P1. Intellectualism defines perception as a purely logical judgment or interpretation that fills the gaps left by sensation or rectifies appearance to match objective truth.
So the mind is assumed to possess all the true concepts like parallelism, constancy, straightness, and it just corrects the faulty senses.
Yes, the intellectualist looks at an illusion, say the moon appearing massive on the horizon, and says, that's an illusion corrected by reason. The mind knows the moon's diameter is constant, so the perception of hugeness must just be a faulty interpretation.
And this is where Merleau-Ponty introduces the core phenomenological insight.
This is it, P2. In crucial phenomena like optical illusions, the Zollner, the Miller liar, the perceived object is ambiguous and shifting, and may literally refuse to conform to objective reality. The perceived transformation is an immediate, positive experience that resists any logical correction.
This is the crucial point we need to emphasize. Merleau-Ponty insists the lines in the Zollner illusion do not merely appear to converge, only to be corrected by a later judgment. He says they are converging in the act of perception.
Absolutely. If the intellectualists were correct, then attention should act like a searchlight, merely illuminating the pre-existing objective facts. You should be able to simply decide to compare the two main lines in isolation, realize they are parallel, and the convergence should just vanish.
But they don't vanish.
They don't. The convergence clings to the figure. And why? Because the perception isn't waiting for a logical concept to organize it. It organized itself spontaneously.
Which brings us to P3, the apprehension of immanent sense.
Right, P3. To perceive in the full sense of the word is to apprehend an immanent sense in the sensible before judgment begins, which provides the very sensible text that motivated the subsequent true or false judgment.
So the immediate spontaneous structure of meaning comes before any logical analysis, and it's actually the condition for it.
Perception, in this view, is the constitution of meaning for the thing perceived that is not pre-existing in some abstract mind. It is in the moment of seeing. The ambiguity and the resistance of the illusion prove that our experience is not merely a faulty shadow of a perfect objective world, it is the genesis of meaning itself.
So the final conclusion of all three logical chains.
See? Therefore, perception is not a logical conclusion or interpretation. It is an act which creates at a stroke, along with a cluster of data, the meaning which unites them.
That is a revolutionary takeaway.
It is. Both of his predecessors were stuck in the same trap, striving for a universe that is perfectly explicit in itself, assuming reality is either pure physical determination, that's empiricism, or pure abstract reason, that's intellectualism.
And Merleau-Ponty shows they both overlook the messy living process.
The transition synthesis, as he calls it. The process by which consciousness actually creates a recognizable, meaningful world.
Okay, to make sure we avoid the experience error in our own thinking here, we need to clarify some of Merleau-Ponty's new operational terms. We've touched on a lot of them already, but let's just reinforce their strict philosophical meaning.
Agreed. His vocabulary is incredibly precise and often deliberately counterintuitive to show the distance between objective thought and our lived experience.
Let's start with the one he's trying to kill. Pure sensation.
Right, so pure sensation, the myth, this is the theoretical, instantaneous, undifferentiated impact of a stimulus. It's sought on the hitter side of any qualified content, but Merleau-Ponty uses it to define what perception is not. He explicitly states this concept is imperceptible and so inconceivable.
Okay, next one. Figure on a background, the phenomenon.
This is the simplest sense given available to us. It forms the very definition of the phenomenon of perception, where the shape is more intense, the edges belong to it, and each part arouses the expectation of more than it contains. It's the irreducible relational unit of experience.
Number 3, the one we keep coming back to, experience error, the trap.
This is the mistake of transposing what we know to be objective properties of things into our consciousness of them. It is simply making perception out of things perceived, and that results in the confusion of scientific truth with lived meaning.
Next up, constancy hypothesis, the dogma.
This is that purely theoretical character assumption of a point-by-point correspondence and constant connection between the stimulus and the elementary perception. It's a dogma that's maintained solely to save the prejudice in favor of the objective world, even when there's contradictory evidence from consciousness.
All right, now for a big one, his new kind of logic, motivation.
Yes, motivation, the new logic. This is the non-causal relationship where one phenomenon releases another, not by some objective efficient cause, but by the meaning which it holds out. It functions as a raison d'etre, or a wordless logic, that tacitly guides our perception and experience.
That distinction between a mechanical cause and a motivational sense is crucial. Motivation guides based on inherent sense. Cause determines rigidly based on a mechanism.
Exactly. Next, phenomenal field, the stage.
Okay.
This is the layer of living experience, which is prior to the objective world. It's a system of self-others things, characterized by ambiguity, spontaneous organization, and shifting context. It serves as the cradle of things and the source of all meaning.
Okay, and this one sounds very philosophical. Original doxa, the foundation.
It is. This is the quite irresistibly self-evident truth that you find in the act of perception itself. It's what cuts through ambiguity and doubt and enables the concepts of objectivity and truth to even emerge. It's the de facto power of certainty, that moment you see the ship as a ship, that later logic then tacitly uses as its unacknowledged starting point.
Last one, facticity, the situation.
This is the unchosen, situated reality of our being, our body, our history, our perspective, which reflection simply has to accept. We cannot abolish our inherence in an individual subject who knows things only from a particular, situated perspective.
These terms are really the tools he uses to build his new philosophy. Now let's try to apply them to the hardest section of the text. Okay, now for what we're calling the crux. This is the paragraph that, when you first read it, often feels like philosophical quicksand.
It really can.
It details the Zollner optical illusion, and it perfectly synthesizes the failure of both empiricism and intellectualism while introducing Merleau-Ponty's own revolutionary insight into perceptual transformation.
We chose this passage precisely because it forces you, the listener, to confront the difference between knowing something is objectively true and perceiving something that resists that knowledge.
Yeah.
That difference is the absolute heart of phenomenology.
I'm going to ask you to read the passage directly from the source, and then we'll break down every single line for the listener.
Okay. The crux. Quote from source, section 3. In Zollner's optical illusion, I see the main lines converging. Intellectualism simply reduces the phenomenon to a mistake, saying that it all comes of my bringing in the auxiliary lines and their relation to the main ones, instead of comparing their main lines themselves. My mistake apparently remains unexplained. The question ought to arise. How does it come about that it is so difficult in Zollner's illusion to compare in isolation the very lines that have to be compared according to the task set? Why do they thus refuse to be separated from the auxiliary lines? It should be recognized that acquiring auxiliary lines, the main lines have ceased to be parallel, that they have lost that meaning and acquired another, that the auxiliary lines introduce into the figure a new meaning which henceforth clings to it and cannot be shifted.
Let's start by translating the objective view, the mistake that he is fighting against. If the intellectualist looks at the Zollner illusion, where parallel lines look like they converge because of those short diagonal crosshatchings, what is their explanation for what's happening?
Their explanation is that the lines are objectively parallel. We know this from geometry. Therefore, if you see them converging, you've made a purely intellectual, a judgmental error.
So it's my mind's fault.
Yes, they assume you failed to pay enough attention. You confuse the auxiliary lines with the main lines. They believe if you could just mentally strip away the crosshatching, the true parallel lines would still be there, untouched, and your mind is simply being fooled or inattentive.
Why does Merleau-Ponty say this explanation is so fundamentally lacking? Why does the mistake remain unexplained?
Because it avoids the real mystery. Why is it so incredibly hard, even when you know the lines are parallel, to actually see them that way? Why do they refuse to be separated? The intellectualist treats attention like a passive focusing of a beam on a pre-existing object. Merleau-Ponty argues the illusion resists this because the act of seeing the whole figure is primary.
Which leads us to the phenomenological view, the insight. What is Merleau-Ponty saying is actually happening when we see those lines converge?
He's arguing that the convergence is a positive, immediate, and spontaneous act of meaning-making. The auxiliary lines don't just add data. They force the entire system to reorganize into a new gestalt, a new whole.
And in that act of reorganization,
In that act, the main lines have ceased to be parallel. They've lost one meaning, parallelism, and acquired another, convergence, that clings to it and cannot be shifted.
so the physical lines might still be parallel on the paper, but for my phenomenal field, for my consciousness engaged with the world, they are not. The transformation is a perceptual fact, not a mental failure.
Exactly. The convergence is an apprehension of an immanent sense in the sensible. The change in the total field motivates the perception of convergence. The meaning comes first, inherent in the relationship between all the parts, and this primary meaning then guides or motivates the subsequent recognition that the lines are not parallel.
Let's use that concrete analogy to really cement this concept of motivation being primary to either mechanical cause or abstract judgment. We'll use the example of the handshake.
Okay, so imagine you are meeting a new professional acquaintance, and they offer you a weak, clammy handshake.
The empiricist view would break this down into raw data. Low pressure registered on the skin receptors, high moisture, low temperature. These are the pure sensations, the so-called bricks of experience.
Right, and then the intellectualist view would take that raw data and calculate low pressure plus high moisture plus low temperature.
Mm.
Logically, this person has an insecure personality or maybe poor social conditioning. It's a logical conclusion or interpretation drawn from abstract data, correcting the body's raw input into a determinate concept.
But Merleau-Ponty is saying we don't experience those steps, we don't perform a calculation. So what is the immediate phenomenological view?
You immediately apprehend the meaning of the act. The person feels shifty or uncommitted or awkward. The clamminess isn't just a quantity. It's invested with a vital value that's derived from your own lived body's expectations of social interaction.
And that immediate feeling of awkwardness, the meaning, then motivates your next action, say being reserved in conversation or ending the meeting quickly.
Precisely. You don't have to logically process the temperature and pressure measurements before deciding to keep your distance. The meaning, that shifty quality, came first, spontaneously generated in the interaction. That's motivation at work.
The sense experience grasps the quality first in its meaning for us, for our living body engaged in the world.
Yes, and this wordless logic, this motivation, is the driving force of perception. It bypasses the need for either mechanical cause or abstract judgment. This is why the Zollner lines converge. The structure feels awkward, shifty, and therefore it changes its meaning.
We have completed the systematic demolition. If perception is not sensation, not association, and not abstract judgment, we are left with a phenomenal field, the world as we actually inhabit it. So what are the major implications of this shift?
I think the first major implication is a kind of philosophical freedom. By rejecting the determinate objective world as the only starting point, we regain the living experience, that layer where others and things are first given to us in their complex, ambiguous reality.
And this new field requires us to use entirely different, more fluid concepts than what we find in traditional science.
We have to.
Why are those concepts like motivation so necessary?
Because objective thought, whether it's empiricist or intellectualist, only recognizes these rigid alternatives. It only understands cause, an external force, mechanically determining an effect, or reason, an abstract logical law governing concepts.
But the phenomenal field operates on a middle ground.
A wordless logic. Motivation is necessary because it describes how a candle flame, which is objectively just light and heat, can acquire a vital value and become literally repulsive for a child after they've been burned. It guides their future behavior without any change in its physical properties.
It sounds like he's suggesting the meaning is built into the world for us rather than being placed there by us.
It is precisely that situated reciprocal relationship. And this brings us to the central role of the living body.
Right. Traditional science reduced the body to a mere object.
A machine receiving stimuli, what he calls an interior without exterior. Merleau-Ponty insists we have to restore the body as an incarnate subject.
What does it mean to be an incarnate subject rather than just an object?
It means the body is the necessary means by which we even possess a world. It is the place where qualities acquire that vital value. We don't just have a body. We are our body.
And our senses aren't passive receivers?
No, they're instruments of action and expectation. The body is always actively seeking a maximum grip or purchase on the world. Sense experience, therefore, is a vital communication with the world that makes the world present as the familiar, thick setting of our life.
This critique extends beyond just psychology, doesn't it? It goes to the very core of philosophical method, the act of reflection itself.
Absolutely. The fatal shared flaw of empiricism and intellectualism wasn't just in their specific theories of perception, but in their methodology. They both assumed that reflection, if you just performed it correctly, could ascend to a place of absolute finished knowledge.
A universe that is perfectly explicit in itself, stripped of all ambiguity and contingency.
They were seeking a kind of divine, all-seeing perspective, essentially trying to abolish the specific, messy, individual perspective we all inhabit.
And Merleau-Ponty argues that true reflection has to accept its own limitations.
It has to. It must know itself as reflection on an unreflective experience, which means it can never fully detach itself from the soil from which it sprang. We have to accept our facticity, the unchosen, situated reality of our body, our history, our culture. We cannot abolish our inherence in an individual subject.
The intellectualist pretends they can call up simultaneously all the primary thoughts which contribute to my perception, achieving a full accounting of consciousness.
But that's impossible. We have to recognize the fundamental opacity of perception and consciousness. We are always in the world, always situated. We can never achieve that transcendental abstract ego which resides nowhere and can be everywhere present in intention.
The fact that we have a body means our knowledge is fundamentally anchored and perspectival.
It has to be.
So if we accept this inherent opacity, what is the new task of philosophy? If it can't achieve that finished absolute truth, what is it supposed to do?
Well, the goal shifts. It moves from reaching a final answer to exploring the process itself. The task is to explore the perpetual beginning of reflection, where an individual life starts to reflect on itself.
And the philosopher has to acknowledge that perception itself is the original doxa.
Yes, the decisive act of certainty that makes all logic, all science, and all truth possible in the first place.
So instead of trying to escape the private field of experience, the philosopher's task is to reinstate the active perception within that field, acknowledging that reflection isn't the abolishment of our situation, but a creative operation that participates in it.
It's a profoundly humbler task. It means philosophy has to stop trying to achieve the clarity of geometry or physics. It has to deal with the ambiguity, the shifting, and the fundamental tension of being a conscious subject situated in a world that is not yet fully explicit.
We started by dismantling the empiricist's myth of pure sensation and the intellectualist's failure of abstract judgment. We've established that perception is an irreducible, immediate act of meaning creation, operating via motivation, and housed within the complex, situated reality of the phenomenal field.
And this leads us directly to the great unresolved tension at the heart of conscious existence. Merleau-Ponty looks back at the philosophical traditions that tried to locate consciousness either with God, absolute reason, or with nothingness, mere mechanism. And he points to Descartes' strangely contradictory definition of humanity in the fourth meditation.
That famous phrase that describes the human as being a middle term between God and nothingness.
Exactly. So if our knowledge, even our own reflection, always springs up without itself knowing its own source, offering itself as a gift of nature.
And if we're constantly caught between absolute reason and our situated, opaque body,
then what does that mean for the pursuit of finished knowledge?
if we accept the inherent opacity of perception and the fact that we can never entirely possess our own history or fully justify our starting points, does the philosophical struggle to know become more important than finding a final truth?
It suggests that the core of philosophy may not be in providing the final answer, but in continually restarting the question. If perception is the perpetual beginning of reflection, then true knowledge is found in the struggle to inhabit that middle term, the tension between the contingent, meaningful body and the abstract concepts we use to try and describe it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the creative, lived reality of perception. Go forth and explore the phenomenal field.